Marcia Day Chilbis from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities, which brings you this weekly Medical Center Hour. This is one of our History of the Health Sciences programs, which are co-sponsored with historical collections in the Health Sciences Library. Because even though this is a program about the present moment and what's ahead, it also has a very interesting, or as our principal speaker has said, a rocky and peculiar history. Early history of marijuana's prohibition is well known, thanks in part to a classic work on the subject, The Marijuana Conviction, co-authored by Richard Bonney when he was associate director of a commission appointed by Richard Nixon. In 1972, this commission rather surprisingly recommended decriminalizing marijuana. At the same time, though, it rejected legalization of the drug, citing major public health concerns. Fast forward 40 years, past the leniency of the Ford and Carter administrations, past the Reagan White House's zero tolerance toward all illegal drugs, past millions of marijuana arrests, past the dizzying costs of a seemingly unwinnable war on drugs, and past efforts to approve medical use of marijuana. Then, in 2012, support for decriminalizing marijuana suddenly returned. Voter initiatives that year in Colorado and Washington State legalized marijuana for recreational use. And in 2014, voters in Alaska and Washington, D.C. did the same for private use, with legalization happening yesterday in Alaska and tomorrow in the district. Did we time this program perfectly? Not surprisingly, the public health worries that were raised by the Commission in 1972 are back, complicated by the manifold challenges of implementing these laws. In this Medical Center Hour, Professor Richard Bonney, who has both chronicled this story and been a player in it for more than 4 decades, will reflect on why marijuana prohibition has suddenly collapsed and what should happen next. One of UVA's most distinguished faculty, Richard Bonney is the Harrison Foundation Professor of Medicine and Law in the School of Law, Professor of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences, and Director of the Institute for Law, Psychiatry, and Public Policy in the School of Medicine, and Professor of Public Policy in the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy here at UVA. He didn't bring all of his hats today, but he's wearing them anyway. Also, we have Dr. Nassima Ait-Daou, Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences, who will respond from an evidence-based medical perspective. And after that, you'll have your chance to have your say. This program, again, is co-presented with the History of the Health Sciences lecture series. And there will be no reception or samples following. Also, both speakers have disclosed no financial conflicts of interest. Richard.
Well, I hardly know where to begin with this topic. So it has been now 43 years since the Commission issued its report in March of 1972. And as Marcia indicated, I have something of a historical perspective on this, and I think given the series of which this is a part, I want to be faithful to that purpose here. So I'm going to spend about 2/3 of the time talking about the history, kind of going over the territory that Marcia just reviewed. But it is the case that I have been, well, A, I'm not a historian, I should make that clear too. So you might even have questions about the history, but I think it's stood up pretty well in the 40 years that the book has been out there. But of course, I've been a participant observer, in this story, and therefore I'm just warning you, even when I'm doing the history, it's going to be hard for me to avoid some personal observations and digressions. That's the real threat here, is too many digressions and I will never get to the second part, which is, okay, what should we do now, given where we are, where my observations are not meant to be descriptive, obviously, but I do have opinions about what should happen, and so I will share them with you. All right, now let me get my first crack at it. See, did the wrong thing already.
Point it at
Huh?
the
Point it at the screen.
Use the right arrow key or
right
This
arrow.
Okay, yes. Oh, actually, this is very helpful. So Nassima, one of her slides provides a little vocabulary guide for all these different approaches that are now being explored, and I thought it would be helpful actually if I started with this. I mean, it's actually a little small. I don't know whether you can see it well, but let me just use it as the occasion to just define a couple of key phrases that I will be using right from the start. So the bottom one is decriminalization. And so what the Commission recommended in 1972 was that the prohibition against non-medical, if there had been some, non-medical use and non-scientific use of marijuana remain in effect. So the drug still would be a prohibited drug available only for research purposes under the Controlled Substances Act, where it's classified under Schedule 1. But that criminal penalties basically be removed from users and the behavior that basically is associated with use, possession of paraphernalia or casual distribution among people that are essentially users, and essentially non-commercial activity. Part of an issue to be raised in connection with the decriminalization scheme is, well, so what about cultivation for your own use? Should that be permissible? And my view all along has been it should be. Which, as you can see, that kind of blurs a little bit between the kind of the more general idea of legalization and decriminalization. But the basic idea is stop arresting people and putting them in jail, for marijuana. So that was what was recommended, and then lots of details about when you're implementing that. Is it a civil fine if it's not going to be a criminal fine? And those issues have been disputed and debated over the years, and decriminalization schemes change, vary on some of those issues. So the second idea is legalization, and the idea there is essentially a regulatory program, so that the drug is lawfully available for non-medical uses, which we basically call recreational uses, often, I think you will see, I will say, unfortunately, the point is usually put, we should regulate and legalize marijuana like alcohol. Well, that's not a compliment to a regulatory scheme, because that's a failure in many ways. So the question then is, what should a regulatory regime look like in this connection? So that would be legalization, wherever that is put on the slide, recreational marijuana legalization. Now, what has happened, of course, as part of the story is that, and this we did not anticipate in 1972, but that the drug has been legalized for medical use in its smoked form, right, which of course is from the standpoint of normal distribution and manufactured distribution and regulation of medical drugs. Having a non-standardized form of administration that you smoke makes it a unique case. But of course that has been done, and it's played an important role in the history, and that continues to be a potential policy option for states that don't want to do either of the other two things. All right, so those are basically the three types of legal approaches that can be taken. The other thing to be said, of course, is that we do have a federal system, and use, possession, sale, manufacture, cultivation of marijuana outside the legitimate regulatory channel, which is only right now under Schedule 1, having it for research, legitimately for research purposes, is a federal crime. And that remains the case, notwithstanding everything that is going on in the country. It is, to a lawyer, befuddling, right, that this is going on. But it is, right? So you have the federal law that makes everything illegal, and meanwhile, we're having all this reform that's going on at the state level. The states, I won't make this point, see, this is a digression, I shouldn't be taking it, but I'm taking it anyway. So if the states decriminalize, that is not a problem, that is not a conflict with federal law. The federal government can make it an offense. That doesn't mean the state has to make it an offense. So the state could just basically immediately repeal all of its penalties with regard to marijuana. That's it. And then it's up to the federal government to enforce federal law. Right. So decriminalization by the states does not present a conflict with federal law. The legalization programs do constitute a direct conflict with federal law because everything a state does to facilitate the distribution, taxing, and so on of the product, when they set up the regulatory scheme and facilitating and licensing people to sell it, is obviously complicit in a violation of federal law. The states are violating themselves. They're not only authorizing other people to do it, the states themselves are violating federal law, right, every day of the week, right, every minute of the day. So a befuddling situation that marijuana reform has come to since the days in 1972. Okay, so that's what it means. So now let me, in terms of just looking backward, so I'm going to just summarize the story here, and pretty much as Marcia has done it, and then reflect a little bit on each one of these phases from my own point of view. So the marijuana prohibition, as Marcia said, this is probably a well-known story about the killer weed, right? But our book kind of went into how that actually happened, and it roughly begins in the late 19th century, largely associated with immigration from the South, either from the Caribbean or from Mexico. And whenever the immigrants were sort of brought their, drug of choice into the country, there would be nativist kind of responses, or maybe not only non-nativist, but concerns and worries about what the consequences would be. And you can kind of watch the map fill in terms of prohibitions that were adopted. Again, you can see it in the Southwest, you can see it, in the Southeast. Also, because cannabis was in the formulary, the medical formularies, and what did have medical uses, there were some attention given to whether or not it needed to be there and what the possibility of non-medical use might be, and concerns about it. And you would actually have some local prohibitions that were adopted, in the urban areas of the country, in the Northeast also. But this was kind of a spotty thing. And then, about sometime in the 1920s, there was some greater attention called to the problem, a lot of popular press, and that's where a lot of the killer weed rhetoric comes from. And that provoked some interest on the part of the Bureau of Narcotics at the federal level, which had been established in the wake of the Harrison Narcotics Act in 1914, when the federal government first got into the regulation of cocaine and opiates. So eventually that led to a uniform narcotic drug act, which included marijuana, that each of the states adopted, and then to the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937. And so the book basically traces all the myths and exaggerations about marijuana that were associated with that process. And that's pretty much, and the penalties just got worse as an earlier drug wars increased and escalated the penalties for narcotic drugs, of which marijuana was classified as one. As those penalties went up, the penalties for marijuana went up. So I got into this in 1969 and 70 because there was a cover on the cover page in Life magazine in which a Virginian, young kid, college student, got what a mandatory 20-year sentence for possession of a small amount, of marijuana. And issues like this were cropping up all over the country, which is what led, as the use patterns obviously changed in the 1960s, it led Congress to establish the commission. And so that kind of led up to that process. So what then happened, I think, just in general, is there's been what has been a 40-year period of the gradual unraveling of marijuana prohibition, beginning with the commission report report, and some considerable success that decriminalization basically enjoyed in the political process. It became kind of, a mainstream proposal. It was endorsed by all the editorial staffs of the leading newspapers, National Education Association, National Public Health Association, American Medical Association, American Bar Association. Go right down the line. After the commission recommended decriminalization, everybody got on board and said, yes, it sounds like a good idea, right? And we had 12 states between 1973 and 1977 that actually adopted decriminalization. And so that seemed like what the future would be. And when our book, which we had been writing at the time that all this was going on, came out in 1974, it said something like, the collapse of marijuana prohibition is at hand, right? Well, that turned out not to be true, and at least a little bit premature, and that's because that process that I was describing was interrupted by a fairly surprising swing of the pendulum back toward zero tolerance, and then which kind of developed into the drug war. So I call this the reconsolidation of marijuana prohibition for about 15 years or so. And then reform got revived, so there's another phase, and that has had now the decriminalization and medical legalization as characteristic features of this reform effort, which I date from the Compassionate Use Act in California, which set up a regulatory program for distributing marijuana, which, as I said, is completely in defiance of federal law and has stimulated, confusion that we still haven't ended. So the phase after that, I thought it was on the slide actually, but is the phase that we are currently in, which is the collapse of marijuana prohibition. And we don't know exactly how this is going to end up. So I'm going to kind of walk through this. There it is, the collapse of marijuana beginning, and I date it from 2012, when Colorado and Washington, to the surprise of everyone, completely flabbergasted me that they adopted the initiatives that then led to actual legalization of recreational use. I thought we were now in for some continuing struggle with, where do we want to end up with this? We'll start with decriminalization, which is what I expected would happen in the 1970s, and then we'd have some time to think about whether regulation actually made sense or was necessary or not, and that we would have some period of decades, going through that, and instead, and we still may, but, suddenly they kind of jumped over a few steps, right, with the regulatory approach that was adopted there. Okay, so back to the, just as I said, I want to walk through some of these points with a little bit more detail. So the charge of the commission was in its first report to make recommendations with regard to what should be done with regard to marijuana policy, and that's the report that I just mentioned. The second report was a comprehensive review of drug policy, and that was issued in March of 1973. The approach taken to marijuana was essentially a cost-benefit approach. There were some references to John Stuart Mill and some other values that are involved in this and privacy concerns. But basically it was that the costs of the prohibition as it was then, far outweighed the public health benefits, and that as long as you keep the prohibition intact and enforce it in a sensible way, you could avoid all the costs that go along with arresting young people and whatever other consequences that might have in terms of respect for law or altering career paths and some of the issues that we of course continue to deal with. So it was essentially a cost-benefit approach. It basically assumed that our objective was to discourage the use of the drug. And in fact, we also said, if you look at alcohol and tobacco, our policy with regard to alcohol and tobacco should be to discourage use of those drugs too, and to keep prevalence down and worry about the public health consequences. And the issue then was when you have a prohibition, your alternative is whether you continue with a prohibition. With alcohol, obviously, that got too costly and we repealed it. But there were, after alcohol prohibition was repealed, as you know, a lot of different state experiments with the best way to have a regulatory policy with regard to alcohol that would protect the public health. So what we said was you might want to legalize marijuana sometime if you can identify a regulatory regime that might get the balance right between protecting the public health and avoiding some of the costs. All right, some of the reasons that were given for rejecting legalization, so I've given you the argument for decriminalization. We rejected legalization for marijuana for a variety of reasons, and maybe I'll just say a couple of things now and hope to come back to this later. But that we didn't know enough about the effects of marijuana use. And we sort of made what we thought were worst case assumptions. First of all, the drug is addictive or dependence producing, even though there was a lot of arguments that it wasn't. Secondly, that we are particularly concerned about the effects on young people, and we don't know enough about that. And we assume that people that use heavily, chronically, over a long period of time are going to have some of the consequences that we can identify with addiction to other substances of abuse, and certainly we have the parallel with regard to alcohol. We said it will never be as bad as it is with alcohol, right? But there obviously are going to be long-term consequences of chronic heavy use and all the social costs that go along with that. So we assumed all that. Marijuana is not innocuous. By the way, it's not as harmful as alcohol, but it's not innocuous, and there would be social public health consequences if it were more widely used. So we need to be careful. And one of the reasons we need to be careful is that if you look at the regulatory schemes that we have for alcohol and tobacco, in its own case, is a failure, right? So that we need to learn more about how you do that. How do you regulate a drug that you've decided to legalize and make available for what we call self-defined purposes, recreational purposes. But how can you get it right in terms of protecting the public health? And so we said those are reasons that we are not recommending legalization. That may change over time, we said. All right, so when the commission was over, and with regard to the larger commission report, I should just say a couple of words about that. We would recognize it as a public health approach to addiction today, with an emphasis on demand reduction, keeping prohibitions in effect, but trying to facilitate prevention initiatives, stop relying so much on locking people up, and trying to use the legal process to the extent that you can to facilitate treatment for people that need it. Drug courts were not the term then, but diversion from the criminal process to what we would recognize as drug courts today was very much a part of what the commission recommended. So a lot of what you think now as current drug policy reform was in that report in 1973, and a lot of it was actually implemented. I should say this. Again, I have the luxury of being able to say I was there. I know that policy was implemented in the Nixon administration, it was implemented in the Ford administration, it was implemented in the Carter administration. The pendulum didn't begin to swing, after that. And in fact, in terms of the history of, shall I say, public policy in this country, the Nixon administration, despite Richard Nixon's disavowal of what the report said, was actually one of the most enlightened drug policy administrations we've had, during this period of time. Anyway, after the report was issued and the work began, I had two clear perceptions about what the agenda for drug policy reform was. On the one hand, we need to reduce the reliance on criminalization and the features of criminalization for the illegal drugs. And on the other hand, we need to learn how to do regulation that promotes the public health with regard to the legal drugs, right? I mean, you've seen pretty clearly that that's the point of view that, having studied this for those years, that I came out of the commission with. And in the subsequent years, it turned out that I had an opportunity to pursue both of those agendas, and I think they interact in an important way as we think about what should happen now. So I mentioned after the commission, with regard to marijuana, we had this flurry of decriminalization in the states, and had considerable support also in the White House. I didn't mention that earlier, but notwithstanding Nixon, the people that were basically running the first, drug czar program that was put in place then were supportive of this effort. When Ford took office, we did a white paper on drug abuse in which basically the Ford administration endorsed decriminalization and was moving forward in that direction. A lot of state interest, as I said, the National Governors Association, we did a report for them too. And all this was kind of moving in that direction, certainly with the Carter White House specifically endorsed decriminalization as well. But somehow it hit a wall, and I roughly put it around 1977, 1978. And it was swept away by what became a gradual movement toward what became referred to as zero tolerance, and then, as I said, developed into the drug war. And at least with regard to one feature of it, I do want to highlight what I think in retrospect was important. There hadn't been any data, there hadn't been any surveillance data in place with regard to drug use. In fact, the commission did, we're all used to seeing these national surveys of drug abuse for high school students and for the population at large, that we see reports all the time now. So they have good surveillance mechanisms in place with regard to drug, alcohol, and use and other behaviors. So we did the first surveys in 1972 and 1973, and then eventually the government took over that task. But we didn't obviously have, a lot of data going back in terms of what the prevalence, incidence and prevalence of use of these drugs, might be. But meanwhile, the surveys were continuing to be, to be done. And there was some indication that experimentation was going up among young people, and maybe at younger ages in the 1970s. And so that, was, I think legitimately alarming, and it spawned what, I think, in retrospect was actually a very healthy development, although I didn't think so at the time. These grassroots parents movements, families for drug-free kids or parents for drug-free kids, whatever they were called. And now you had a kind of a coalition, political coalition of people that were concerned about drug policy moving maybe in a bad direction. And they identified decriminalization of marijuana as the evil. Okay, I think that was wrong. I think empirically it wasn't decriminalization. You can look at the states that decriminalized and the states that didn't. There was no difference. This was a kind of a secular or longer term trend with regard to use. But I think the very idea of saying the drug, the penalties are too strict, and that the penalty, you shouldn't be punishable, sent to some people the wrong message, as if this was a good thing to do. The commission said that is the problem, is that we have over-relied on the criminal law for social control when we really ought to be talking about churches and parents and communities, trying to facilitate, healthy and safe development of young people. And if all you got to say for what you want kids to do is that it's against the law, you have a problem, right? Because you're not developing the message that actually is responsive to the needs that adolescents, have. So that had been one of the main messages in the report. As I said, we over-rely on the criminal law. Well, the problem was, that's why it came to an end, right? Is that people were worried that we needed the law, because we were going to hell in a handbasket. So now it was a different focus. Before it was the hippies and, smoking at rock concerts. But now, as I said, legitimately, you should be worried about the teenagers. But this was the wrong response. But that, I think, is essentially what happened. There was another feature of what happened during this period that also needs to be mentioned. It wasn't only about marijuana and what happened in terms of the escalation of use among kids and the dropping of age of first use and things that, as I said, we probably should be worried about. There was a big crack epidemic in the 1980s, beginning in 1985, which also was associated with a tremendous amount of gun violence and changes in the crime rates. And that is, and then the accompanying support really at that time also with regard to the HIV epidemic. When all those things happened, that together also propelled what became the drug war period. And so what happened with regard to marijuana reform is that marijuana then got sort of reconsolidated with the nation's struggles against drug addiction and drug use, substance abuse more generally. And again, what the commission had said is there's no such thing as a drug problem, right? There are different drugs, there are different patterns of use, and you ought to address each of them particularly and adopt the policies that seem most appropriate, for the particular policies. But lumping marijuana in with all drugs is bad policy, and yet, of course, it happened again. So that's another reason why things essentially came to a halt. All right, so that's, at that point, I went off the stage, right? Nobody wanted to hear what I was saying, right, when this happened, right? And by the way, I think in terms of ideological purity, this was a horrible period, actually. I wasn't the only one. There were a lot of people that were kind of more liberal in that respect with regard to drug policy, although, as you can tell, I was not a legalizer, right? But nonetheless, there wasn't any message that was not a zero tolerance message was not tolerated. Right, and so there were a lot of people that basically were off to the sidelines, and at least in my case, I had something else to do. I had a nice job, I had tenure, so it was fine. But at least as far as this story is concerned, so I ended up spending a lot of time on the other part of the reform agenda that I mentioned after the commission. I was on the first National Advisory Council for NIDA in 1975 to 80. And so a lot of the issues with regard, we put tobacco actually on the agenda for NIDA, which had not been there before, right? And so that kind of initiated some, I think, important developments. I think NIDA got a great start, has done a great job over time. A lot of the early neuroscience investigations, that many of them that we now, in terms of the tremendous advances that have been made in neuroscience research, a lot of them started with regard, to drug abuse investigations. So this was, I think, an important period. A lot of these surveillance systems, as I said, were put into place. Also, during this period, there was what we now certainly recognize as an important public health initiative, recognizing the challenges of chronic disease for the population as a whole and the need to focus on individual behavior as, the determinants, among the determinants of, serious chronic disease problems, heart disease, cancer, and so on. And so a lot of government reports in Canada, in this country, in Western Europe, focusing on the need for lifestyle change and the Healthy People of series, for any of those that you know about that began actually, and I think it was the first series was for 1980. And so on the panel that was responsible for setting out the public health objectives for alcohol, tobacco, and illegal drugs, I chaired that panel. And so there was an effort, connection at that point to kind of, get involved in connection with tobacco and alcohol. Let's see whether there was anything. Oh yes, and in fact also in National Institute on Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse, there was also concern about taking a closer look at the regulatory models that we had in effect for alcohol and seeing whether actually, if you're really interested in promoting the public health, we ought to take a look at the way that alcohol policy was going, because beginning in this period and certainly continuing to the present day, if you took a look at what's happened with alcohol policy, you would say that what we are doing as a country is trying to facilitate the use of alcohol, removing lots of impediments that were, that existed in the post-Prohibition era, and making it easier for people to get alcohol anytime. You didn't used to be able to use credit. Of course, you didn't used to have bars either. all of that got changed. And you didn't used to be able to use credit cards in the ABC stores. But of course, now the hours of the ABC stores are open, more, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this was, I think going on in HEW and HHS. And IOM, the Institute of Medicine, also did a number of reports on this matter that I was involved in, having to do with preventing tobacco initiation among kids and reducing underage drinking, and then more recently trying to take comprehensive tobacco control strategy to end the tobacco problem. which eventually many of these recommendations are reflected in the Tobacco Control Act that Congress subsequently passed. Okay, so then the story here goes back to the marijuana story, because by the end of the 1990s, the drug war had receded somewhat, and as I said, marijuana prohibition began to unravel more. And so two questions to address. So what happened during this period, roughly 1996 to 2012, and then why did it happen? All right, so here are three parts of the story, I think, about why it happened, or what happened. First is the medical marijuana, the Compassionate Use Act in California, and then so many states that kind of followed in California's wake. And this is a big story on its own, and I will resist the temptation to go into it deeply, but just to make this observation. It is perfectly conceivable that you could set up a compassionate use access program for marijuana without compromising the integrity of the prohibition against recreational use, right? Even smoked product, you could set up a regulatory regime that made it clear that you're only going to get it if you have these, particular problems, that getting the permission is tightly controlled, and that it takes the Controlled Substances Act approach and channels it into obviously a different, regulatory channel. But it doesn't have to be done the way it was done in California and Colorado and the other states that basically just made it so easy because it was really a stalking horse for recreational use, right? And it blended into recreational use, which is, of course, what the drugs czar said right from the start. I was in favor of medical, marijuana, regulatory approach, but not the way that it was done, right? And so I think that obviously, in retrospect, that played a very important part in this story. Support for decriminalization in the Marijuana Commission sense, was revived. What is so amazing is that it took 40 years, for that to happen. When we wrote our report in 1972, there were 200,000 arrests for marijuana. We said that was too many, right? In 2000, I can't remember the year that I'm picking this figure out of, but there were 900,000, arrests. So there had been, approaching 1 million arrests for marijuana, year after year after year. So this should have been done long ago, and as I indicated earlier, I thought when this revival of support for decriminalization occurred that we were in for some phase of wider decriminalization, but then really starting to talk about legalization. But then, of course, suddenly you had these initiatives in Colorado and Washington, which completely changed the political context entirely. The whole focus of the debate then shifted, to the question of regulation, and we're, as I said, continuing to cope with that now. All right, so why did it happen? Shift in public opinion quite clearly related to demographic changes in the population. So baby boomers, my generation, are less worried, given the history, about, marijuana. I think that plays a part of it. I think the younger, our children, the younger generation have increasing voice in many of these issues. I think there's been clearly in our country a libertarian ascendancy, of which this is a part, and certainly it's clear in Colorado, just to take that as an example, that's, I think, a very important part of what has happened there. The reaction to the excesses of criminal justice policy in general, and particularly the drug war. I mean, we see that the parties are actually coming together to say, wow, look at all the mistakes that we made over the last 20 years in terms of over-incarceration and over-arresting people and so on. It's been very costly, and we need to reverse that. Well, obviously, changing drug policy is an important piece of that. All the fiscal pressures that are related to that as well. I mentioned that marijuana legalization has been a Trojan horse, essentially, in retrospect. And you have this federalism issue. So I do think we can see everywhere there's a kind of recalibration of federalism going on. And I think marijuana reform really is something that probably needs to be done, at the state level, that what California began as a defiance of federal law, the Congress should have said something beginning then, right? Yes, we will reschedule marijuana, we'll create it its own schedule, and a state can actually set up a regulatory scheme. We could have said for marijuana, for medical use at that point, but I think as time has gone on, we're talking either about medical use or recreational use, and the states can decide what they want to do, as long as the regulatory scheme conforms with a set of specified criteria that are in the federal statute that emphasize certain things that, that, as I've been saying, are more protective of public health. Then let the states innovate. Let them experiment with this. This is the perfect example of where we need that kind of, the innovation is going on anyway, but it's going on without any, in defiance of federal law and without actually the constraints that need to be imposed on it. So I think the devolution of power to the states and localities is actually, an indicator of, a larger, set of developments that are going on in the country, and I think that also accounts for what has happened. All right, and I've already slipped into what we should do. Let me end, and I think I've given you a signal about what I think we should do, but maybe we can talk about it. I want to say a bit more just to show you what the Commission said with regard to why it rejected legalization. The Commission said, we are recommending legalization at this time. No matter how tightly controlled, legalization would signify approval of use. Now we said that's not true with decriminalization. You should not understand that to be true of decriminalization. Decriminalization is just saying you don't need to arrest and put people in jail for doing something that you're trying to discourage them from doing. There should be no confusion about our policy. It's to try to discourage people from using marijuana, and certainly young people. But if you legalize, there's no doubt that that would be regarded as a signal of approval, and we said that is certainly premature in 1970 to be thinking that you basically wanted to approve the use of marijuana. We said there would be a significant public health problem that would be likely to emerge due to the increase, inevitably, once you increase prevalence, increase in chronic long-term heavy use, and use of more potent preparations. By the way, all of that is happening, now. We're worried about kids, right? We didn't emphasize that as much, at the time as you would now, in light of everything that we've, been able to ascertain about drug use patterns among kids and the effects on them, and maybe Nassima will say something more about this, but particularly, concerns about the developing adolescent brain with regard to susceptibility to addiction itself, and for all drugs, including this, and their particular vulnerability to the onset of mental illness and many other issues. So we mentioned that, but I think now that's an important part. And in addition, not enough is known about designing regulatory models for protecting the public health. And so I'll just read you what the Commission said about that. The regulatory approaches used in the cases of alcohol and tobacco have failed to accomplish two of their most important objectives: minimizing excessive use and limiting accessibility to the young. Despite restraints on distribution and consumption, more than 50 million Americans smoke cigarettes and more than 9 million are problem drinkers. Later on, future policy planners might well come to a different conclusion. If further studies suggest a feasible model, if responsible use of the drug does not take root in our society, if responsible use of the drug does take root in our society, if research uncovers no long-term ill effects for moderate use, if potency control appears feasible, now that's a very important feature, and if passage of time and the adoption of rational social policy desymbolize marijuana so that legitimizing its availability is not equated in the public mind with approval and encouragement, as I said, which has been, I think, the warning sign from alcohol. So that raises the question about whether or not we have better models today than we had then, and so I'll just close with this observation. The answer is the alcohol model remains the wrong answer, and unfortunately what has happened in Colorado and Washington has greater resemblance to the alcohol model than it does to other models, and particularly with commercialization, which I think is a real problem here and could be avoided. The better model to be looking at is what's happening with tobacco. Because finally, we have learned that we need to develop a regulatory model, which actually for tobacco is designed to discourage the use of tobacco, right? But it's not prohibition, and we need to explore the regulatory space in between prohibition and laissez-faire, anything goes, which is pretty much what we've got for alcohol. And we are learning how to do that with tobacco. And that is the subject for another talk. So I will stop.
Hi, everybody. I do have to make a slight amendment to the disclosure form. I was asked by two people today whether I was wearing green in support of marijuana, and I have the short answer is no. So, okay. What I'm going to talk to you really is to add a little bit to the wonderful presentation that you put together for us is the evidence base, what do we know, why there is so much debate about marijuana. And from one hand, we have the federal prohibition that Richard did so well explaining. And as you see, marijuana is a DEA Schedule 1 because the belief is that there is high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use and treatment, and that it's not safe, and if smoked, it's actually pretty harmful. So, and on the other hand, we have the pro-marijuana people who have put all these wonderful properties to marijuana, saying it does everything. It's actually a pretty miracle. And you're not allowing me to use it. It's just wrong. So what states had to do is really fend for themselves and figure out what to do with that. And as of I think today, we have at least 27 states that have some type of legalization of marijuana. We have 4 that have legalized medical marijuana, and it's changing every day. I sat in the Virginia Governor's Substance Abuse Committee to discuss whether Virginia should go forward with legalizing marijuana, and if we have time, I can talk a little bit more about that. So we've seen this slide. So why do I worry about it? I worry about it as a psychiatrist, as an addiction specialist, and as a parent, because when we say legalizing marijuana, it's really changing. We're telling our youth that it is okay, that it is safe to use. And what we've noticed from data collection is that there is a correlation between perceived risk and use among youth. So if you're saying it's okay, let's have people use it, there is an increase in use among adolescents. And this is another data that's very, very interesting. What you see in red are the number of teens using marijuana in states that have legalized marijuana, and the gray one are the states that have now legalized marijuana. And you see that there is an increase in number of teens that are using marijuana in states that have legalized marijuana. You want to know why? Because they think it's safe. And Virginia is just there. So I definitely I don't feel like we want us to go up and see more youth using marijuana. So why do we worry about it? So what we know from evidence-based data is that daily use of marijuana before age of 17 is associated with higher dropout from school. 60% of those teens are less likely to get their high school diploma than those who never use pot. 18 times more likely to become dependent, 7 times more likely to attempt suicide, and 8 times more likely to use other illegal drugs in the future. And if that's not enough, there is a change in brain morphology in teenagers, even if they're not using it every day. As little as once a week, they found that there is a change in brain morphology and a drop in their IQ from childhood average to adult low average by an average of 6 points. So there is recently a paper from the head of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, Nora Volkov, who sums it up. What we know for sure is that the addiction, our overall level of confidence that it causes addiction, we're totally sure, abnormal brain development, progression to use other drugs, schizophrenia, depression, and so on. We know it's not as safe as we think it is. And the discussion was with the committee that I'm a member of is, should we pass medical marijuana? Let's not talk about recreational marijuana. Let's talk about medical marijuana. That's safer. We know that marijuana has some components that are very helpful that we want to see developed. So why doesn't it fulfill FDA criteria for purity? When if I write a prescription for someone to go get marijuana for whatever reason, for spasticity, for pain, I don't know whether it's being given. I don't know that it's pure. It has over 400 chemicals, and it changes from one plant to another. Dosage, I cannot say, go and smoke 3 joints a day for the next 3 weeks, because I don't know what each joint will have. There is no dosage form. There's no well-defined, measurable ingredient, and we don't have data that says, yes, if you smoke 3 joints for 12 weeks, you have a reduction in your spasticity. We have no such data. There is no quality control. There is no difference between medical-grade marijuana and street marijuana. Clinical trials, we have very limited clinical trials because it's a DEA Schedule 1 drug. We have very little research on it. And we don't know a lot about long-term safety. We know that it's definitely toxic to developing brain. So again, I feel that if asked to prescribe marijuana, there is already THC-based drugs that are available, that are FDA approved, that I have used in my practice. There are at least 2 here. There is a 3rd one that has not been approved in the US, but they are available. And there are some that are also in the pipeline. So, and it's interesting, I did not know Richard's talk today. I did not know what he's going to talk about, and I was a little worried about contradicting what he's going to say. He's such a respected figure in the domain. But I have to say that, when I look at it, I look at decriminalization and I say, is this our best option? And there are 4 points that decriminalization folks bring to the table that I think are really worth discussing. Decriminalization of marijuana frees up police resources. We know that for sure. That far more harm is caused by the criminal prohibition of marijuana than the use of marijuana itself. I think they have a point there. It's not 100%, but I think they definitely have a point. Decriminalization does not lead to greater marijuana use. I'll show you some data. We don't have the data. That's why it's very important for us to really learn about it and collect data. And criminal laws prohibiting marijuana possession do not deter marijuana use, and I think that is really the biggest point. We are failing very badly. But what I know also is there are 60,000 people who are behind bars because they use marijuana, and it's costing states like $1.2 billion in taxes to keep these people behind bars. They should not be behind bars. So, going Dutch, the reason I wanted to say a word about the experience in Netherlands is because in Netherlands, it's still a prohibited drug, just like in a lot of the states, yet it has been decriminalized, meaning that if you go into a shop that is designated, you can smoke marijuana over there, but it's very designated and it's regulated by, they have to be, they cannot be underage. And so we were very curious to know what will happen. And what we found is when they compared the data is that their youth are not using more marijuana than the US youth, even in states where it's prohibited and it's not legalized. So there is definitely something to learn from them. And I like what Richard had said, is that because it really apply in Netherlands, is there is a control. The people in Netherlands are very much respectful of that freedom they were given. So there's no drug, there's no availability of drugs for youth to use. They know that they can use it, so they don't have to go buy it on the street and take it home. They can go to a coffee shop and get it and use it for whatever purpose they needed to use it. So what's next? I think for my point of view is that we need these restrictions on marijuana research to be loosened up. We need to learn more. I think there's so much that could be learned from it, but we don't know a lot because it's again DEA Schedule 1, and the American Academy of Neurology said it very well. Thank you.
Thank you both. We have some time for you all to have your say. Questions, comments are welcome, and I would ask you to please identify yourself when you ask your question.
very much. That was a great presentation. My name is Gabrielle Marzani. I'm a psychiatrist. And I was just curious to know if there are any regulations with driving now in Colorado and Washington. I mean, is that something that seems to me that is one of the big concerns that people have, not only the age of use, so that if you were 30 and older and had, very strict restrictions on driving, that's one approach.
Well, of course there are restrictions, and I think that presents a behavioral challenge and sort of engineering, challenges and policing challenges. I haven't seen anything. I took a look at the report that Colorado just put out. They put an annual report about sort of what the consequences have been. I flipped through it. I didn't actually see anything particularly about the driving issue, but there are a lot of people that are actually paying a lot of attention to it, right? Because there's no doubt that that's one of the things that you want to try to get a handle on. You don't want to replicate the alcohol experience with regard to marijuana. I think I remember seeing some evidence that at least in some localities, there were more people being identified as being under the influence of marijuana in driving than alcohol, right? So it's no doubt that this is something that we have to be on top of.
I've got a follow-up. Hi, John Aris from the Bioethics Center here in the Philosophy Department. Just a follow-up question on that. With regard to alcohol use while driving, there are quantitative measures that the police use to determine if somebody should be pulled aside and ticketed or locked away. What is there with regard to marijuana?
No, so that's the problem. It stays in your system longer.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so that's what I meant about the engineering problem. I mean, this is beyond my immediate expertise right now, but there are a lot of people working on it, right?
And Lois Shepard in the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities. I was wondering, Richard, you talked about the alcohol policy regulation a little bit, and said we shouldn't go down that road, but if you could just give us some details on what's bad or good, or if there's anything good at all about our alcohol policy.
Well, what I would say about the things that, looking at it from the tobacco standpoint, about what we have possibilities of trying to do with regard to tobacco, without talking about alcohol, because the politics of trying to deal with alcohol, I think, are just extremely, very, very different. One thing is that you have to have, it would be great to have greater control over the product in a way that avoided the connection between the manufacturer of the product and the consumer, right? And the effort to recruit people to the product and promote use of it, right? So the problem, with alcohol and tobacco has been that you have the vested interests of the manufacturers in terms of trying to encourage use, right? So you've got to deal with the commercialization problem. I think that's an absolutely essential condition, right? And it would have been possible, it's still for any other state that wants to go down this route, to actually set up a scheme under which you make as a condition for having any license that you're going to make available for people to produce and distribute, that you basically don't allow advertising and promotion, of the product. So that's one. Another important thing is the channels of distribution and how much control you have over the channels for distribution and the number of outlets and so on. And this was the post-prohibition issue with regard to, insight with regard to alcohol for so many states, is that you limit the numbers of places that you can, get the drug. You make it more costly and more, less convenient, and you don't promote. You also obviously want to send your protective public health messages. There are a lot of things that could be done that are very different from alcohol, but that are beginning to resemble what the tobacco model, might look like in a decade. So that's just a couple of examples.
Hi, how's it going? My name is Kevin. I'm an undergraduate student here. My question is for you to comment more about the future of synthetic cannabinoids, marijuana. Specifically, I know you talked briefly about Marinol, which is, I'm pretty sure, pure THC. And from what I remember, there was even perhaps a few deaths related to Marinol in the past couple of years since it's been released. And as we all know, there's never been a death related to cannabis. So my question is, where do you see that regulation coming from in synthetic THC, Marinol, etc.?
Thank you. Very good question. So Marinol is THC, it's synthetic THC. And what we have about Marinol is that we have safety data. And what we don't have about marijuana being, we don't control what's being used, we don't really have safety data. We know that there is no death from overdose, although there's actually one case for somebody who had a heart disease, we know that, but we don't really have control, we're not collecting, that's why I'm saying we need to really collect that data. And we cannot collect it unless we could do that research. There are some components, there are people who are against Marinol for multiple reasons because it does not have the same effect as cannabis, and I agree with them. So Sativex, for example, is actually marijuana, it's not synthetic, it's pure marijuana, and the good thing that it has THC, but not just the THC, it has CBD, which is another component that's very important, and that's actually where we have the most therapeutic element of marijuana. So there are some in the pipeline that are actually exciting, more exciting than Marinol. Sativex is one of them. There is another one that has only CBD, but it's natural CBD that is being tested for epilepsy. But we will know the dose, we will know the safety, we will have that data available. So that, I think, what is exciting about it. I'm not saying that Marinol is safe for everything, and I'm not saying that marijuana is unsafe in everything, but we don't have the data, and we need more to have that data.
So it sounds like a situation of stay tuned.
Yeah.
And it will be quite interesting that we're just across the line from DC, and we'll see what some of the fallout is from that. Again, please thank Richard Bonney and Nassima